And welcome everyone to this exciting episode of Conversations. Today's conversation activity is a pre-UWI Guardian Group Premium Open Lecture event, and we are honored today to have Dean and distinguished Professor Pedro Antonio Noguera as our guest speaker. You know, Professor Noguera is a leading scholar on issues related to education, race, and inequity. He currently serves as Dean of the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. Professor Noguera is well known, well published, and we are excited because we know he is an advocate, a very strong advocate for various issues in education. In particular, if you follow him on Twitter and on LinkedIn, you will see that he's quite popular in various areas and themes. And he has authored several books and articles. And his most recent book is A Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the tough questions and complex issues confronting K-12 education in the United States today. You know, he was the winner of the American Association Published Prose Award in 2021, and he serves as special advisor to the governor of New Mexico on education policy. He also advises the state departments on education in Washington, Oregon, and Nevada. And in 2022, he was appointed to President Biden's National Commission on Hispanics and served as co-chair of the State of California Black Student Achievement Task. Now, I can go on, but certainly today we want to say welcome to Professor Noguera. Welcome, Professor, to this event, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. You know, today we are diving into the theme of redefining education success in the post-pandemic world. I'm your host, LeRoy Hill, and I have invited some of my colleagues. To join me in posing some questions and framing and reframing the conversation with Professor Noguera. So for the want of a metaphor, let's imagine this as a dinner table, and we're inviting our guest, Professor Noguera, to really join us in this event. And so in my table today, I'm really honored to have some of my colleagues with me, Professor Brian Cockburn, Dean, Faculty of Science and Technology. We have Dr. Suzanne Burke, who is our public orator for the UWI St Augustine and head of Department of Literary and Cultural and Communication Studies. That's a mouthful. And Dr. Priscilla Bahaw, who is lecturer in entrepreneurship and agriculture. Agribusiness management. You know, colleagues, Professor Noguera, welcome to Conversations. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Great. We recognize some quick housekeeping that we need to do. So in case you have a question, in the audience, we recognized already that you can use the mic, but also in those who are online, you can go ahead and raise your hand. So if you would want to use the mic, we want you to continue adding your comments and feedback in the chat because this is a conversation and we certainly want to propose that. Our first segment, we look at looking at the future of education. And you know, I'm going to turn over to Professor Cockburn to pose his questions or his thinking as the first question to Professor Noguera.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. So trying to ease into the subject of the future of higher education. Today, of course, most of the popular conversations about the future of education revolve around generative AI and the disruptions it has already brought and the many more to come. No doubt we'll get into some of those in a minute. But during the pandemic, the focus was on a couple other areas that I'd like to draw some attention to. So, of course, the pandemic made remote teaching a common phrase. And mercifully, the tech to support that already existed in the form of Blackboard, Collaborate, and then followed by Zoom. So perhaps the ease with which that was accomplished lulled us into an inappropriate sense of comfort. We know that much more needs to be done for genuine online teaching experiences. Very much like the high definition video we are enjoying at the moment. I was pleasantly surprised when Dr. Hill introduced us to this room and the very professional staff running the show. I'd really like to pay some attention, of course, to how we embrace these technologies, the insatiable appetite for online programs, and the flexibility that they bring to higher education. I have a host of questions, but I think I'll just open with that and invite our guests to respond. Thanks.
So thank you for the question, Dr. Cockburn, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you and part of this program. I've been thinking a lot about both the disruptions created by the pandemic and the opportunities that it affords us. And as you mentioned, we learned that we could move quickly to online teaching and learning, which was a good thing, given that we had no alternative. The problem, as I see it, is that it is not particularly creative. It is simply for students sitting in front of a screen for long periods of time, or for the instructor speaking into the screen for long periods of time. And so I don't think we've even begun to consider how to use this medium more creatively. I want to encourage all of us and the viewers to think about this. The most powerful educational technology learning tool that exists right now is YouTube. I want you to think about why YouTube is the most powerful. Because anything you want to learn to do, you can find it on YouTube. From how to fix something in your home, to how to make something on your stove, to how to do a math problem, to how to write an essay. And with artificial intelligence, that ability will be enhanced. What makes that powerful is that a person learning can stop it, have it go backwards to repeat what they just learned, because if they didn't absorb it all, they can take notes, they can use it to learn how to do something. When we rely largely on lecture, we're largely just explaining information, covering the material. And in fact, that's not the way most people learn. Most people don't learn by sitting passively and absorbing information. They have to have time to process the information, to pose questions. We learn through interaction. And so what I would encourage us to think about is, how do we make these tools we now know are widely available to us much more engaging, more interactive, more user-friendly, with the user and how they use information at the center, rather than simply using it to deposit information to cover material as we've done so far. So I think we're just beginning to understand and appreciate the potential for using technology to deepen learning and to make it more widely accessible than it has ever been.
Thank you, Professor. And certainly it invites us to think about student engagement, and that engagement requires sometimes innovating our strategies and teaching strategies. There are so many student strategies, and many of them have come to the front. And we notice that we are actually focusing a lot on using things like H5P. We have a workshop on that as well. And I wanted to ask, I know we have a lot of questions, but I'll ask Dr. Burke if you could just pose one of your questions that's burning when it comes to teaching innovation strategies. That what comes to your mind?
Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure to be here. Okay, so given all of that we've talked about in terms of AI and technology-driven education, I am particularly concerned about indigenizing the classroom. Because I think, as you said, we have to meet students where they are. And culture, arts and culture, is one of the ways that you connect, because innovation has to do with connection. So I'm going to ask you if you have any examples you can share with us in terms of using indigenized strategies, culture, arts. So for instance, in my classroom, I use stick fighting, right, as a way to teach leadership, innovation, business strategies, etc. So they go to Gael and they stick fight. Yeah. And that connection resonates with them. So I'm just wondering if you have any examples of such, strategies. And then the other part of that question would be to scale, right? So one teacher can do that, but how do you scale so that an institution develops a culture of indigenizing the things that they teach and the processes and outputs of their teaching?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Burke. And so let me say that when we start to think about culture as the medium through which learning occurs, we have to then ask ourselves, well, how do our students learn when they're not with us? Because they're learning all the time. And most of the time, they're learning by doing, they're learning by observing, they're learning through their mistakes, because when you're learning something new, you're always making mistakes. And hopefully they're learning through feedback from someone who is a master or at least better at the task than they are. And so when you think about how learning is situated within the natural world, within the culture, then we have to then figure, okay, how do we make learning in our classrooms more like that? Which means we have to first know who our students are and then provide numerous opportunities within the classroom for learning to mimic the way it's occurring outside of the classroom. So your example of stick fighting, I'd love to hear more about that. I hope they don't get hurt stick fighting. but what it again is reminding us that learning needs to be active, interactive. We've heard the term engagement. Let's unpack that a bit. Engagement is multidimensional. It's behavioral. That is, are they on task? That's the part we can see. But it's cognitive. What are they getting from it? Do they understand? Can they process? Can they apply what they've learned elsewhere? And it's emotional. Do they actually care? Are they invested? Are they working at their highest level? Or do they give up as soon as it gets difficult? When you can bring all three of those dimensions together, then what we see is not only are students more deeply invested as learners, but the learning outcomes, what they learn, is more likely to be retained because it's valued and it's integrated into the person. And so I always say that if we're concerned about achievement, we need to keep in mind that's the outcome. The means to get there is through engagement, and culture is the medium of getting them engaged.
Wow.
Some of those sound like fighting words there. Actually.
Yeah.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. Because the example that we got with stick fighting, that's a visceral experience. And this is one of the concerns about online learning experiences. Do you lose that visceral aspect that's necessary to acquire psychomotor skills and those physical competencies? Can you hold equipment the correct way? Can you manipulate it accurately? And so Dr. Burke's example kind of veered away from the YouTube example. So I wonder how you reconcile those two.
So so imagine that you want to learn stick fighting through YouTube, right? You go on YouTube and they'll demonstrate someone stick fighting. Then you stop and you could say, well, how are they holding the stick? How do they defend themselves from the stick when it's coming at you? And you're watching, and then you can repeat again, so that even as you're watching, you're practicing with your own stick.
Correct.
Right? Even better if you have an opponent to work with. So I think that, again, in this example, we can use the medium of the online learning. It's not the same as being in a classroom with people. And I think we should point out that human beings learn best through human interaction, right? So while we can use the technology, I think it would be a mistake to say it's just as good as live and in person. It's not just as good, but we can get closer to making it almost as good if we think about how people learn. And we have to, most of us here learned the old-fashioned way. We sat in class, we listened, we did what the teacher was told, and we demonstrated that we learned the material. That's not the way most people actually learn things, right? How do you learn to cook? How do you learn to dance? How do you learn to stick fight? You learn by doing, you learn through mistakes, you learn by modeling, seeing it done well, and you learn through practice, repetition, till you get it better and better. What we should be after is mastery in learning. Right? We want our students to come away with solid evidence that what they have learned can retain and now apply. That's a different way to think about learning.
Yeah. And I just want to say that I want to embrace the power of the and. So it's not either or. So in the example that I gave, we actually do videos of the stick fight, right? So they look at it, we explain it, then they go to the GAL, they engage with a master stick fighter in a safe environment. That is taped. We get back into the classroom. We look at them fighting and we talk about, so what are you doing here? Look at the position of your feet. So how are you engaging? Exactly. So it's both. Yeah. So it's not either or. So they experience both kinds of learning. Yeah. To model, to practice, to fail, to go back again, do it, tape it, look at their improvement, look and talk about the emotional engagement and connection as well. So I got better at this. Look at the position of my feet. Look at, so those kinds of things. So it's not either or. You can integrate all of the things in the teaching learning.
I like that metaphor of and, because it really gives a very good sales pitch for universal design for learning, because there are multiple pathways that we need to explore. And so the idea for, I would say, part of the future, and just moving on to the next section, is that the future for education is more multimodal in that regard. Many things and multiple pathways. Before we go on, we're just going to take a short break, and then we'll come back. We'll go on to the next segment, which looks at from the learner's perspective. And so thank you for staying with us, and we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Conversation, and we are certainly enjoying the discussion. We noticed that there are some comments in the chat. We'll spotlight those in a while, but we really want to continue the conversation quickly because we know time is not on our side. And I want to invite Dr. Bahaw. Your questions from the students' learner perspective. We started to look at some of those. What does that look like? I know you have some questions. I want to give you the opportunity to contribute your question at this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. I would like to say firstly that this conversation has been extremely insightful so far, so I'm gaining a lot of insights. Now, I'd like to circle back quickly on the technologies that we have been speaking about, particularly AI, artificial intelligence, and its intersection with academic integrity. Funny enough, it also goes by the acronym AI, if you will, right? Now, the consensus is that artificial intelligence is basically providing education. It's revolutionizing education. And there are challenges. We would not deny that. But we are witnessing apps like, for example, ChatGPT. It has taken the world by storm. So my question is really, what measures can be put in place to prevent the misuse of AI and also to safeguard the integrity in education?
Well, that's a very important question that I think many universities and schools throughout the world are grappling with now, because the proverbial genie is out the bottle. They have it. They have the ChatGPT. You can't tell them they can't have it. They already have it on their phones. They have access. So the question now is, how do we make sure this tool, and it should only be thought of as a tool, is used constructively and not in ways that will infringe upon things like copyrights or contribute to plagiarism, et cetera. So the analogy I would use, it's, what many students don't realize about ChatGPT is junk in, junk out. That is, if you don't use the correct prompts, you will get information that to an unsophisticated user may not realize there's inaccuracies here. There are, I'm plagiarizing someone else's work here. So the instructor has to tell their students, if you use ChatGPT, you need to know what are reliable sources. How do you make sure you cite those sources correctly? which sources are questionable. If you just wholesale use what you get, we will know that you're plagiarizing and you will be penalized just as if you copied from a book. And so, warning students and faculty, because I would say there are faculty who think I can get many articles published now with ChatGPT, that if you don't cite correctly, if there's copyright infringements, you run the risk of grave and serious violations of academic integrity. So I think, again, a hammer is a tool, but a hammer can be used to destroy or to build. AI, similarly, can be used to enhance learning or for a lazy person as a substitute for learning. And we have to make sure our students don't see it as that substitute, but instead realize, no, this can help me and to be more efficient and hopefully even more sophisticated in the kind of work I produce.
And to add also, I think from a learner's perspective, the learners need to be aware. I think one of the key things we need to re-engineer our course outlines and our learning spaces to ensure that we are very front-facing about this. That the students understand that these are our expectations and how exactly you are going to encourage them to use AI ethically. And that is a very, very important aspect of the whole learner perspective standpoint, because you can't expect me to know if you really, what are your expectations as a teacher? And I think that's important.
I was hoping that we would have left AI for a little later because it is such a huge subject right now that we still haven't come to terms with the challenges of genuine online teaching yet. AI poses some fresh challenges that we're really struggling with. The issues around plagiarism are real, but the potential of the tech in terms of bespoke learning experiences, it's so vast with potential that faculty are in need of training to really explore some of that potential, because right now, even our computer scientists are only starting to understand what is possible. You mentioned garbage in, garbage out. There's also perhaps the more subtle concern about biases with respect to the use of AI, generative AI. With research, you can generate false data using generative AI. It's the issues are really endless. We would need a whole week just to mention all of them.
And even the hallucinating,
and
making up.
And the widening gap where you have now socioeconomic factors superimposed on your existing educational issues. You really open the Pandora's box here, Dr. Bahaw. AI is big.
But this is the world we're in now, and so here one of the challenges related to this is that our students are probably more familiar than our faculty with how to use it. And so, as you said, we have to get the faculty up to speed with what is it, how do you use it, and how can you misuse it, so that they in turn can prepare their students to use the tools effectively and not result in cheating and copyright infringement and the like. But it's going to be a huge challenge, because we know often with technology, adults learn a lot slower than young people do.
And I know, Professor Cockburn, you mentioned about the whole idea of bias, and I also think the idea of inequity. I know Priscilla, I don't know, Priscilla, if you want to ask any question about that. In terms of inequity in higher education, I think that has an impact, particularly posing from a learner perspective. We really want to get an insight, a conversation to that regard.
Certainly, Dr. Hill. So the world has been becoming increasingly interconnected now with the technology that we are speaking about, and that has brought a new dimension of diversity into the classrooms and what teachers are prepared to deal with. So my question really is, how can our curriculum and our teaching methods become more inclusive, one, and two, accessible to students of all backgrounds and abilities?
Very important questions. And let me start by saying the big equity issue we saw during the pandemic is some people didn't have good internet. Some people were working off their phones. So there was unequal access to learning because we weren't always able to get devices and good internet to all learners. And therefore, those who had it had an advantage over those who didn't. So that's the starting point for the inequity. The second point is that, as you just raised, Professor Bahaw, that the learning needs of our students vary based on their abilities, their language, the circumstances they're living in. And so we need to be aware of those differences, even as we make use the technology to make it available. Now, what we know is that you can, for example, learn a second language through your through your phone, right? If you know how to use Duolingo and other tools. I think similarly, you can help students who have learning disabilities or who have difficulty with reading if you know how the applications to rely upon. So that's where our learning specialists need to work with faculty to support students, because we need to, if we keep in the frame of making this student-centered, right, as opposed to teacher-centered, then we have to make sure that the tools that we know are available to our students so they can access the learning and not be left further behind as we become more reliant upon technology.
Yeah, and I immediately comes to mind of the whole idea of adaptability. How adaptive are we in terms of providing that sort of pathway to the person who have this particular preference or where they want to learn or where they are in terms of readiness. And I know that that's one of the affordances of AI in education, in that it can certainly chart the progress of students even within the learning management systems. We see more learning management systems giving you the affordance of being able to, customize the learning experience for the students. And I don't know, my other colleagues have additional questions.
Can I just add to that about customizing learning experience? Because this is in some ways the most powerful change we can bring about. The most important thing for any learner is feedback. The most challenging thing for any teacher is providing feedback, because meaningful feedback is what allows the student to understand, how do I improve upon the product, the work product. If you just simply put a grade, that does not tell the student, what do I need to do differently, right? Because the real learning is in revising with clarity about what I'm aiming for, what is evidence of mastery. AI allows the professor, the teacher, to provide differentiated, personalized feedback to each student, which is so important. Because as any faculty member knows, the hardest thing about teaching is grading, right? Sometimes it can take, hours and hours and hours. So if any tool that will help us to do this more efficiently and to give students better, more precise feedback is going to be very, very helpful.
Thank you, Professor. And I am really excited to know how many things, and I know we mentioned faculty development or teacher readiness, especially when it comes to AI. And that's an important part. And even for us here at Settle, we already acknowledge that. We've done a number of sessions. We have in our YouTube channel, you can follow some of them. But certainly what we have done is that we recognize that you can't use an isolated approach or even singular approach. And we've taken the commitment to integrate throughout all our offerings, using AI in various ways in our workshops and in the Cuttle program as well. So it's important to see that we are not ignoring the needs of our learners from the learner's perspective. And I want to go back to the teaching innovation, because I know Professor Burke, you had additional questions, and Professor Cockburn, you had additional questions. It really begs us, how ready do you think we are in Trinidad, Professor Cockburn, do you think, how ready do you are? How ready do you think we are? Are we resilient enough to try new things? Where do you think we are? Don't know.
You want to go? Well, the question I have regarding innovation and AI and technology and whatever strategies a teacher chooses to employ in a classroom is that it takes courage. It takes a lot of courage to innovate, right? It's risk-driven, yes? And so for me, the institution in which that teacher is residing or the environment or whatever has to be enabling. And because you can take a risk and you can fail.
That's right.
Right? And then, of course, there are student feedback forms and you get it. And, you know, the lesson was an abject failure. And you go, well, not me, not again. I go in the safe way.
Right.
So I want us to talk a little bit about that reality for teachers, right? Because innovation is risky. It takes courage. Yeah. And how do we then encourage in the institution a culture of innovation, a culture of feeling safe? So if a teacher gets in a classroom and this doesn't work one time, it's okay, right? It's not punitive, yeah? So
that's a great question. So let me offer a suggestion. And this was developed in Japan. They call it the lesson study, where teachers present a lesson to other teachers. Right? This is what I want to try out with my students, and the other teachers are the students, and they give them feedback. And it's both to model and say, okay, how did that go? Is this effective? But also what you've done is now you made teaching less isolated, right? And it's a collective task of figuring out what's the best way to present this material. Does that particular approach work? So you're making teaching more transparent. And that's what we really have to work towards. Because too often it's one person in a class on their own, trying to figure it out, and we don't do our best work that way.
So then there's a culture of collaboration as well.
That's right.
And trust.
And trust.
Very important,
So,
right?
you know,
very important.
Dr. Hill knew what he was doing when he tossed that particular grenade into the room. Okay. The idea of peer evaluation of teaching, it came up recently, and Dr. Hill, in his wisdom, is introducing this specific campus to peer evaluation in a very gentle manner. Yeah. So it's not for assessment or evaluation. It is for development. My interest as a dean, of course, is having peer evaluation supported by a formal structure. And to actually form part, we say teaching is important. Okay, let's assess teaching. It does require trust. It does require building it into the culture, and that's going to take time. I don't know that we have time. Dr. Hill asks whether or not we are ready. I don't know that we have time because the time seems to have been a decade ago.
A decade ago, yeah.
So there is that challenge.
I'm sure that as a fellow dean, I share your concern. And one of the things I know is if we make it clear to our faculty that this matters, it's going to be taken more seriously. How do faculty know it matters? If it shows up in performance reviews, right? When we're talking about merit increases for salary, right? How are you teaching? Have you, what are your teaching evaluations show? Have you gone through professional development? And what have you learned? Once they see that this matters as much as their publication record or the grants they brought in, then they will know, oh, this is a school, a university that takes the quality of teaching seriously. Yeah. Until then, it's all lip service.
Yeah, yeah. And I know, Professor Cockburn, you support your view very strongly when it comes to the evaluative part of the peer observation, but we at Settle, I'm teaching excellence, but we have advocated for a more developmental approach. So that is why we were intentional in deconstructing it as an evaluation, more as a peer observation and feedback. Because we do know there are cultural nuances towards evaluation and the additional impact. And I do know the merit of that, but certainly my view is half a loaf is better than none. And I think this particular framework begins to have us deepening the discussion around collaborative and developmental practices that could perhaps agenda as part of a wider evaluative process later on. But I think so. Thank you for dovetailing the discussion to that, because I think it's an important part of our teaching excellence. Until we are able to reflect and say how well I'm doing through the eyes of another person, then we may be boasting for nothing. You know?
So, can I offer another suggestion? Because I appreciate what you're saying, that we don't want this to be punitive or simply as a means of holding people accountable. We want it to be beneficial and help them to grow as professionals. So in medicine, they have for many years implemented what they call medical rounds, where a lead physician will take residents to visit patients together. And what is the point of this? This is to show them, what are they learning? They're learning, how do you ask questions of the patient to gather information to ensure that the needs of that patient are being met. That is so much more effective than sitting in a classroom and hearing that, because you're working with real people and seeing how, hopefully, a master physician works with patients. Imagine if we could do that in classrooms, where you take new faculty to see Professor Burke in action, stick fighting with his students. Okay, let us watch this and let's see what are the students learning from this example. And then the debriefing, the processing about what we saw in the classroom that we do together, that is helpful for allowing those teachers, those faculty to become better at what they do.
Certainly. And Dr. Burke, you raise an interesting point in terms of the culture surrounding that whole aspect. Because in entrepreneurship, one of the things that we saw in the research is that fear of failure dampens innovation. So if we can endorse a culture, create a culture where fear of failure is okay and we learn from it, then our teachers would be able to, feel free in terms of practicing new things to keep their students engaged. Because one of the things I noticed, and this is coming out of the post-pandemic setting, is that as students are transitioning back to in-person learning, rekindling their motivation, and just keeping them engaged in the classroom is extremely a struggle for me right now. So, Professor, I would like you to shed some light in terms of some specific things that you can share with me in terms of how can I really keep my students engaged as they have returned back to the classroom.
So I appreciate the question. It's one that I think about a lot too. So again, remember those three dimensions of engagement, the behavioral, the cognitive, and the emotional. The more learning is active, the more likely it is to touch on those three elements. So one of the things we know, for example, debate. Debate is a very powerful and effective way of teaching. Why? Because it forces the students to come prepared. They have to do the research so they can engage in a debate. It forces them to listen because they have to think on their feet. What did that person just say? How do I respond? It forces them to think about, how do I present these ideas in a clear, coherent, cogent manner so they're intelligible to others. And so many different elements come together, and it forces them also, while you want it to be emotionally powerful, you also want it to be rational, drawing upon evidence. And so imagine how useful such a tool is for learning something, almost anything we can think of, because those tools can then be applied in life, right? Think about how different society, we talk about education is so important for democracy. Democracies die if people can't engage in civil debate, right? And learn to listen, learn to look at objective evidence and make decisions. So you can use tools like debate and simulations in the classroom as a way to help students to think about how to apply what they're learning in meaningful ways.
I just want to jump back in here. Dr. Bahaw, having your students elbow to elbow, so to speak, does have the added advantages as well of peer-enhanced learning. Hearing your colleagues struggling with some of the same issues you're struggling with, or hearing them express their understanding of an issue in a way that resonates more with their colleagues than the lecturer might be able to bring it across. So it goes right back to that visceral experience I'm talking about, of having people in person next to each other. A lot more I could say on that, but LeRoy, leave it to you.
Time and certainly I want to say thanks to the panel. We want to find out if our in-person audience have any questions. There's one question, so we will give you the opportunity to pose one question. And so in our audience, you will state your name, your department, and then you state your question.
Hi. Thank you. So great insights thus far. Really happy to be part of this conversation on the future of education and all the great works that is being done. So part of the conversation, I really love the idea of the indigenous-based learning with stick fighting. It make me now think I'm going to go to YouTube and really probably look at some of this stuff on stick fighting, because I think it really gives value when you're sitting down in a classroom and you feel a connection. So I'm really happy for that that point that you made in terms of the classroom. So we are speaking a lot about AI, and do you all believe that AI, well, everybody is saying it, that AI really is changing how we will teach and how the student now will be in the classroom? So one of our projects that we are working with is a design thinking pilot project for innovation. We're really testing it with agriculture, right? A hydroponics. And the reason that it's so exciting for us, because you all said it, AI now is, you could go on YouTube, you could get any information. So over the next few years, and I'm sure, we may be in the same thinking, that you could learn anything. So why would somebody now want to come and sit down in a classroom? What are they going to learn? What are they going to learn? So this design thinking, we are hoping really will teach people to solve a problem. So because now, you could go and get anything, learn anything. As you said, stick fighting, you could learn to fix something in your car, anything you want. So the point now, a student needs to be able to solve a problem. So I think design thinking is a strategy to really do better problem solving, to be enhancing with the AI technology. And I think when that works, we really see the future of education, So thanks a lot. I really, really enjoyed the conversation. My name is Shivani Sinrang, by the way, UWI Global Campus.
If I could offer a response. Because one of the things that concerns me is that as we think about tools like artificial intelligence and relying more and more on technology to facilitate teaching, that we may overlook some of the indigenous tools for learning that are still very powerful and effective. So here we are in Trinidad. What is the last thing that people with Alzheimer's will forget? They will forget music of their youth. They'll forget your name. They'll forget the name of their spouse, but they will remember the calypsos they grew up with for a long time, to the very end. Why? Because music is so powerful in the way it affects your brain. And so how do we use music, storytelling, and incorporate that into our lessons so that we're not entirely just dependent upon technology, but we're bringing in other visceral experiences that make the being present so valuable? Because I think you're absolutely right. Why will they need to come to the university if they can do all this at home? Well, because there are things that you can do in your classrooms that they're not going to get on YouTube. And it's the experiential part that makes it powerful.
I particularly like that point that you just raised about the music and the calypso, because I felt isolated at one point, thinking that I'm the only lecturer that would use extempo in my class. So like we would go through a particular topic, and then I'll put them into groups and say, you guys need to come up with a 2-verse extempo and sing it aloud in front of the class in terms of what you've learned. And they have a wonderful time doing that, even if it's a 5 to 8 class, 4 to 7 class. It's late, but they get the energy to do it.
This is great, Dr. Bahaw. So we can perhaps call you and your members of the team to be part of our Laugh Out Loud event later on to the end of the year, because we think music is a very powerful medium in our teaching and learning that should be, central in some of the things that we do. Some of us who believe in integrating arts into education. I'd love to hear, Professor, what are your views on integrating arts in education? And how have you seen it very impactful and ways how persons have tried it? I know Dr. Burke would be particularly interested as well, cultural.
I think it's very powerful. One of my colleagues, a gentleman named Chris Emden, who I'd strongly recommend you think about it. He's been using it in science, and he's developed a strategy called Science Genius, where tapping into the way students use science in everyday life and incorporating that into the classroom with the arts. So with spoken word, with poetry. And it is very powerful because what it does is it demystifies science, so that instead of our students seeing, oh, that's just something that the smartest individuals are capable of, they start to see, oh no, science is part of our lives. And it's actually another means for which to solve problems and to make sense of the world around us. So the arts are a great medium for making information more accessible. So I again, I hope that we continue to draw upon that, because I think it's a very powerful force, as we know, in society.
Yeah, on the whole subject of local framework or flavor. I teach a course and I teach biochemistry, and one subject is sensory systems. And I posed a question one day to my students about a student eating some doubles with slight pepper and a cup with 4 teaspoons of sugar. And they were obliged to describe on a molecular level how the tastings impact with different receptors and how the message gets sent to the brain. Now, many of them were shocked to see something like that on a question paper. But it's science applied to where you are. We're meeting you where you live. Okay, so yeah. I was inspired by the question from our studio audience. But if I could say a few other words about changing the way we think about teaching. In my time, I've seen some things. For example, problem-based learning, which I think was an early precursor of flipped classrooms. It still is not very widely adopted. The grade point system, something as mundane as that, caused a lot of reflection in teaching practice. Previously, people would pitch their lectures at A students, and everyone else would have to scramble up. What the grade point system did for us was legitimize A, B, and C students as legitimate students as well, performing at their level. And the challenge of your lecturers was to provide assessment which allowed them to demonstrate the level of their competencies. Then the pandemic hit, and assessment was really thrown up in the air. Now everybody questioned their methodology like nothing else had provoked before.
Yeah.
And those questions are still going on. They're still with us. Again, I don't want to monopolize and talk too much, but this one, the pandemic, and what it has forced us to think about assessment in particular. We haven't even talked about remote proctoring and the challenges that places on the assessment process. A lot to unpack.
So I really want to encourage you to go back to this idea of performance-based assessment, right? As opposed to just relying on a test. Some people develop good test-taking skills, but their ability to perform what they've learned is still limited. So, how does a person learn to, how do you know a person can swim? Because they don't drown, right? They have to swim, right? So similarly, how do we know a person can solder? Anything that involves doing, you have to demonstrate that you can actually do it at the end. And I think if we can incorporate into our teaching concrete evidence of performance it will result in our students having to rise to the occasion and more of them able to master and by demonstrating competence in what they've learned at the end. So it means that thinking through the assessments is going to be something we should do collectively, because this is challenging. But I think together we're more likely to come up with useful models that will be beneficial to our students.
And if I may, I know, Susan, you have a question, but there's one in the audience is asking, and I think it helps because what does the future of teacher education looks like in terms of preparing our teachers?
That's the exact question I was going to ask, because it has to do with training and feeling that you are liberated to try new things, having the cultural confidence to look at braiding, for instance, and think, I could teach math, I could teach algebra through the process of braiding, because they have to separate each thing equally and, you know, those kinds of things. But it's having that self-awareness, I think, as a teacher, looking at your surroundings and then thinking, I can use that because I can meet the students where they are. And it's almost like, I don't want to say forgetting, but the way that we are trained to teach, right?
Learn.
Laying that aside and just being very kind of aware of your surroundings and meeting the students where they are. And that takes a kind of confidence and trust in what the environment is telling you that you don't always get from the tree.
And I always say that, you know, the way we train teachers should be similar to the way we train doctors. We don't train doctors just in a classroom. We train them in hospitals with real patients. We need to train our teachers in schools with real children. We need to have master teachers who can demonstrate mastery in teaching. And we need to create a safe environment where they can learn through their mistakes to get better and better. But this is why having teaching laboratories is important, because I think for too often the separation between teaching and learning and between what teachers are going to experience when they're in real schools with real children is too great. And we often see as a result they struggle.
Wow. I know we have so much more to say, but I would ask you to please continue to join us in the conversation. Professor Noguera will be speaking at the UWI Guardian Group Premium Open Lecture, which takes place in Dag Auditorium at 5:30. We ask that you be seated by 5 o'clock if you're going to come, but come with more questions, because you could see that we have many more questions to ask and so forth. I want to thank the production team of Settle Links Studio, Mr. Mark Garcia, Mr. Javed Mohammed, Mr. Randy Duku, and so for the efforts in today's production. I am certainly excited by the opportunities of you going on our website and finding out more about Settle Links, and this is certainly part of the teaching innovation that we are exploring, and we certainly would be happy for your support and collaboration. I know I can say very more, but we've passed our time. And I'll end here. I'll ask I don't know if any closing question or any statements. I know you might have some burning questions to have, and then we will close up from there. Thank you.
I just want to say it's been such a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I'm so happy to see UWI is placing teaching and learning right at the center of the work. I just want to encourage you to keep this up. I think this is exactly the priority we should have.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Dr. Hill and his leadership at Settle with respect to provoking conversations around teaching and around teaching practice. It's needed. Only good can come of it. We need to keep talking.
Yeah, we need to keep talking. And certainly, and Professor, you mentioned about being in the classroom, and that's why one of the key things that we are making central in the Cuttle program is the peer observation, because we need teachers to be in the classroom demonstrating. It's an in-service program, and so we certainly want to keep that central because it's an important part, and the classroom is the lab, if you want to see it from that standpoint. Susan, Priscilla, any closing?
This has been very thought-provoking, I must say, and I just want to say thank you so much for all of the insights. I definitely will try to implement all of those strategies that you provided for me, especially as it pertains to engagement in my classrooms. Thank you so much.
And I also want to endorse the sentiments of my fellow panelists, and to say that we really need safe spaces to talk about some of the insecurities we have as teachers in terms of, oh gosh, should I do this? you know, and what will happen if I do that? So I really applaud the division for making this a safe space to start these conversations, and let's keep talking. As Prof
And let me
said.
just make a recommendation. We should get a filming of your class doing the stick fighting so that we can see
we
this.
have
I
film, we
think
have
we're
film.
all very interested, intrigued by that idea. So.
I'll bring my extempo team around.
Exactly. Right.
All right, folks, this is it for us for conversation. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us at the open lecture series. And sorry that we have to leave, but you know, other things have to happen.